I've asked Dr. Alaric Naudé, a guest you may have seen on this channel before, to come back today and give us a presentation that attempts to answer the question, what is a child? Seems like a simple question, doesn't it? But when we're talking about the psychological and emotional development of children, it occurs to me and to him lately that too many people around us who claim to be experts on children have either forgotten how children really think and really develop, or they were never properly taught. It's a safe bet that most parents were never formally taught about child development, brain development, and what is considered normal in terms of how a child thinks and feels and makes decisions, sets up boundaries or doesn't, while they are still physically children, chronologically, legally children. That means 0 to 18 at a minimum. So Alaric is back today to take us through kind of like a lesson. This is not really a conversation. This is not an interview. It's not even really much of a discussion. So be prepared for that. You might even want to take some notes. This is important information he's giving us. It's like a class for free in how your child actually thinks. And it will help you help your child. It will help you protect children. Whether they're actually your children or children in your care, doesn't matter. We should all be more focused on protecting children because evil is real. It is out there. And it is trying to get at your kids. And the first thing it's trying to do is change the definition of what a child is. It's trying to do that so it can change the definition of consent. That's what this evil is doing. And so we're here today to help you learn about what children actually are. And we're going to go through child development phases. We're going to talk to you about what grooming is, how it works, how it's done, how the people who do it are thinking and talking about it to break down your defenses as adults who care about children. And we're going to wrap up at the end with some very basic suggestions on how you can help protect your children. So without further ado, here's Alaric Naudé talking about the evil that threatens our children's safety. Let's learn something. Alaric, thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm sure you're going to teach us a lot of things. What do we need to know?
Okay, so that's a good question. My question to you is, what is a child? I'm trying to follow Matt Walsh here with what is a woman, what is a child? It's not an adult. Let's begin there. So children obviously go through various stages of development, from natal all the way up until puberty and becoming young adults. And there's a lot of different stages. And it's really important to understand those stages they go through, because those stages are indicative of 99.9% of children's cognitive ability. It follows a fairly clear pattern, and most of the models that we have, they've been tested for at least 80, 90 years, or have been in development for 80, 90 years. So that's quite a long time to say, okay, this model is factual or not factual. One of the models we have are Vygotsky, another one is Piaget, and we have Brunner. And basically these different theories, they have a lot of overlap. I don't know if you've had a look at in detail at some of these, but they basically say the same
Piaget
thing.
in graduate school.
Yeah. So they're actually saying the same thing, but from a slightly different angle. If we look at how they break up the stages of development, they kind of correlate to each other in many ways. So if we look at Vygotsky, he said social interaction influences cognitive development, which is very important. That is nurture over nature. That means children are strongly influenced by the environment they're in. And we can see that. We've seen how, for example, identical twins are given up for adoption by different parents in different places. And even though they have some similar innate abilities because of being identical twins, the results are often very different because of the environment that they're brought up in. So that's a very good example that shows that the environment can strongly affect what happens to a child. Obviously, things like natural resilience and all that could be a factor, but still, the environment will have a strong effect. Then we have the biological and cultural development, and we can say that these don't occur in isolation from each other. They feed off each other. So you have many variables. The problem many times is people do a univariate analysis and it just doesn't work because there's so many factors that interact. And another one is that language plays a major role in cognitive development. So the type of language you're talking, English, French, Chinese, Arabic, it's going to affect the thinking style. That's been very much proven. That also ties into the culture. But then even within the same language, the dialect you're using or your understanding of words, the ideology you follow, it changes your perception of things. We saw with the documentary, What is a Woman, right? It should be a fairly easy question to answer, an adult human female. But even speaking the same language, just a different ideology, that suddenly becomes impossible to answer out of fear, or you really don't know, I don't know, but it then becomes an issue to actually understand something just from that perspective.
Right.
So Vygotsky, he was also talking about the zone of proximal development.
Mm-hmm.
So if you imagine the rings of a tree, the center zone is the area that a child already knows, this knowledge. Then we have an outer ring where it's going to expand to. This is what a child can achieve through work. So this is the zone of cognitive development. And then outside that, we have a range that's too far. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you can teach a child to parrot off things that are further out, but they're not going to understand it. They're just parroting it. So a lot of indoctrination works that way. A child is not ready for something, but they keep having it hammered onto them, and it just becomes part of them because they just parrot it on. Cults work in a similar way. You don't need to understand it. You just need to parrot it. And a lot of propaganda works that way as well. Basically, the more you repeat it, the more brain connections you have, and eventually you'll just believe it, whether you want to or not.
Right. It makes sense if you think about different cultures around the world, even when the differences between them are relatively benign, yet they have extremely different standards, let's say, of beauty or different traditions that make perfect sense to them. But then maybe, a Western sensibility comes in and says, I don't even understand how that makes sense to these people because we have our way that we were raised and spoken to, and they have theirs. And it's really important for people to understand that that's part of them. It's not like you can just tell them something new and they go, oh, okay. It's part of how the brain has developed.
Right. So what I keep saying Piaget, what Vygotsky was getting at is that the children will naturally try to emulate the adults. So traditionally, a lot of emulation came from obviously the mother, because the mother was traditionally the person that stays at home. And the population, especially when Vygotsky was was forming these, most of the population was not actually in cities. They were in the countryside. We have now an inversion of populations. For most of history, the larger populations were in the countryside. Cities couldn't really support that many people. You have exceptional cases like Rome, which in its heyday had about 1 million people, or really huge cities like Nineveh with a very huge urban sprawl, and they've recorded very high ancient populations. But generally speaking, countryside populations were high, cities were not that large. So parents influence the child, or a caregiver would influence the child. So that could be a nurse or a nanny or maid or whatever that country had. Now we have someone who spends many, many hours a day with children. Who would that be? A teacher. So for better or worse, a majority of the influence is going to come from a teacher. And what Vygotsky was saying is that language is a means to transmit information to a child. Most children are fairly stupid. I'm sorry to say that, but they don't have a power of insight. They generally believe what adults tell them, especially if they trust that adult, like a teacher. So they're just going to internalize whatever they get told. And then language becomes a very powerful tool for intellectual adaptation or even abuse. You can use it both ways. If you're teaching children the right thing, or if you're teaching them the wrong thing, which is somewhat concerning. So if we then go to Piaget, he broke the stages of development into 4 stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and then formal operational. So sensory motor is from birth to 2 years. And this is where a child is understanding the world through senses and actions. So by doing something, because they don't have that language capability yet. Of course, in all these stages, actually, even before birth, children are learning language, but they're not at the stage where they can actually create output. It's still in the processing stage. So then it moves on 2 to 7 years, which is pre-operational, and they're starting to understand the world through language now. And if you've ever, I'm sure you have, seeing as you've had children, from 2 to 7 years old, have you found that once they start to learn to talk, do they ever shut up?
Yeah, it depends on the child, but typically, yes, they talk, and it's fascinating to watch and to listen, because you can learn a whole lot about them in terms of their personality tendencies, their traits, and people are born with certain traits by what they choose to talk about and how they choose to talk about it. But they do pretty much talk. And in fact, it is a sign of something not quite right if they don't.
Right.
So if you don't have a child who at the age of 3 is a little bit of a chatterbox, at least in private, in other words, at least when they're amongst the people they're comfortable around. Some children are innately shy, and so they don't do it outside the house. But if they aren't chattering, or, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense, that's a sign that something might be amiss.
Right.
So yes. Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're getting at. That's normal, actually, because now all that input that they've been taking, they're starting to create output. They're putting all those different things together, and output begins. And the more skill they have, generally, the more they talk.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but before we went too far down this path, I wanted to, and away from what you said about children basically believing what they're told. I have an anecdote from my own life, and I think it's worth sharing because it's about something so innocuous, and it was meant as a joke, but it shows you, even when adults are joking or teasing with kids, how kids can believe what they say, because they also aren't very good at picking up on wit and certain kinds of advanced humor and so forth. And this is a story from when I was roughly 8 years old. So certainly not a baby. And I heard the expression clay pigeon. I just heard somebody say the word or whatever. And I asked my father what a clay pigeon was. And I don't know why he decided to do this. I don't know why he didn't tell me it's for skeet shooting or explain what skeet shooting was. But he said it's a pigeon that sits on the back of an elephant and picks bugs out of the clay that has gathered there after they've rolled in the mud. And I considered
Seems
my father like,
plausible.
oh, it was sounded plausible to me, an 8-year-old kid. I mean, I was already reading, chapter books. And I mean, from the age of 3 or 4, I was reading pretty proficiently. But he said it in a way that I later learned was his clay pigeon voice. So in other
Okay.
words, so he had a way of doing it, but I didn't recognize it. He was just my dad. He was the smartest person I personally knew. If for most kids, the smartest person they know is their mom, their dad, or their teacher.
Yep.
And so I believed him. I was embarrassingly old when I said something about the clay pigeon and my father said, you believe that? I was kidding. Like, he actually didn't even know, because we didn't have
Right.
occasion to really discuss it every
Okay.
day. And so from then on, it became a clay pigeon story. So in
Okay.
our family, when somebody would tell a fib or just kind of like joke with somebody, I would say, is this a clay pigeon story? Or is this for real? But I just wanted to say that because I think it's a good example of how we adults forget that they are not little miniature versions of us.
Right. They're gullible. Let's put it that way.
They are
Children are very
gullible.
gullible.
They believe what we tell them.
Right.
Absolutely they do.
So that's basically the point we're getting to.
Yeah.
Children are gullible, and therefore that development, you have to be careful. It's not a machine that you want to throw a spanner into, because you can mess it up, and that's a growing child. So if we go to the next step, which is 7 to 12 years old, at this stage, kids start with the logical thinking. But as you said, you were 8, and it wasn't fully there. I mean, this is the starting. So at this stage, you're starting to put things into categories and trying to start with logical thinking. If this, therefore A. And probably because your dad had so clearly explained that this is how it worked, is probably why you fell for it more, because it was authoritative. Okay, that makes sense. Well, there's an ox pecker, and that picks the ticks off an ox. So, I mean, there must be a clay pigeon which does it for elephants. Yeah. Draw two
Exactly.
conclusions, because this is categorization stage, and you're less wise about the world, so you're going to believe it. And then from 12 years onwards, you start to be able to think hypothetically. If A, then also B. Slowly starting to get there, and thinking about things a little bit more scientifically, being a little bit less gullible. So that's generally why we look at 12 years on to 14 years old, and they can be quite smart in some of the observations they make.
Right.
But you could still probably pull a clay pigeon on them if you tried. Yeah. And then we go to Jerome Bruner, and he put basically three stages. So inactive, which is action based; iconic, so that's image based; and then symbolic, which is language based. And for him, inactive was 0 to 1 years. A lot of these overlaps though. So this is physical action. For example, there's a baby rattle, and the baby shakes it, and then they realize, okay, this makes a sound, and this toy is fun. So they draw this conclusion based on the physical thing. If I push the ball, it will roll. Okay, these seem like really basic things, and they are, but it's really important to know this to get onto more complex ideas. That's what their brain can handle. Then 1 to 6 years old, they're very visual, and that's why if we see advertisements that are aimed at children, they're very noisy, they're very bright, they move fast, and they're designed to catch children's attention. So children like colorful things at this stage. That's really important to remember. 1 to 6 years, children like colorful things. Most children. Doesn't matter if they're a boy and a girl. Keep that in your mind. And then from 7 years onwards, they are getting more into the language because they actually have the ability. The way he breaks it up is a bit different to Piaget, but it's still fairly on the same point. And he also was saying that language directly affects cognition and the ability to recognize things. So we have this pattern. Vygotsky said language is important. Piaget said it's important. Brunner said it's important. None of this has been disproved in all the time that these theories have been out there. So we would assume that as these theories have been out there so long, that they would have been disproved by now if they were in fact wrong. So when we're talking about that 0 to 1 age group, for example, if we have a picture book, the baby is going to be playing with the picture book, but they don't really recognize what these pictures are. It's just a colorful thing to them. They don't recognize this as a book. Unless the parents have been saying that all the time, they still don't really know what a book is because that abstract idea is not really possible for them to make. Then we get to the iconic stage, and now they can actually start to put things in real life and make a connection between what's in the book and real life. So, for example, if there's a picture of a dog in the book, they may recognize, well, this is a dog because I have a dog. Or there is a dog in the house. They may not recognize ownership of said dog, but they're starting to put a connection between these two things. So their understanding of reality is not really as concrete as we might imagine it to be. Another very important point to make.
Right. And all of this is important for us to know because when people in positions of authority or, over our children, people who are telling us about our children, be they doctors, teachers, education researchers, are telling us what's good for them, what's best for them. If we don't have this knowledge that you're giving us about their stages of development, what is and is not age appropriate for that, it will be very easy for us to behave just like those children and believe them, especially when they are telling us these things authoritatively.
Right.
And in great detail.
Unfortunately so. So if we have a look at a lot of the videos coming out online, unfortunately, we can say unfortunately, but also fortunately, because at least we now know what's going on. The COVID story has been a bit of a two-edged sword. So it's allowed a lot of parents to see what's going on behind the closed doors of classrooms by some people with some less than savory intentions, and some people that I feel may perhaps have good intentions that are very severely warped out of the context that they need to be in. So they might think they're doing something good when they're really not. But unfortunately, that the result is the same, regardless of the intention behind it. Yeah.
Right. The road to hell and all.
Well, yeah. If I drove a car and I drove it over someone, meaning to or not meaning to, unfortunately, the result is the same. Yeah. Doesn't do that person any good. So these days we've been seeing what's going on, and some teachers posting things like their queer theories and all these things that they are pushing on very young children. And as we've seen from developmental theories that, children cannot understand this. They're parroting it. And it confuses them because they simply don't understand. So if you get a 3 or 4-year-old child and you take a Ken Barbie doll and you put a wig on it and you ask the child, is this a boy or a girl? what are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you it's a girl just because
Yeah.
their association of a girl is someone with long hair, generally. That's how
Generally
children make the
speaking.
distinction. When they get a bit older, they'll say, oh, it's a guy with long hair. But there's quite a lot of development that happens before they're able to recognize that. So we see teachers telling children that I'm not a boy and not a girl. It's confusing to children because they don't understand it, because this
Right.
is a modern phenomenon. And the problem is, if we look historically, the queer movement and the pedophilia normalization movement have a very strong common ancestor. And that all started with Kinsey and also with John Money. And then what happened was the intersectional feminist movement got hold of this idea that, sex and gender are not the same thing. So let's run with this idea. It will be an emancipation from the patriarchy. And they basically ran with that idea. And the other side, which were the radical feminists at that time, they said, well, we're not running with that idea. So that camp kind of split in half. That's why we see at the moment the British side, who are very much against the queer theory, and then we have the American side, which is more intersectional in their approach, and that means that they're all for it. And that's why this problem seems to be spreading much faster in America, and unfortunately Australia and New Zealand as well, because they're more inclined to that direction. We have a lot of people in academia too that are trying to normalize this as a normal thing. Now, why are we talking about queer and the pedophile movement in the same sentence? Well, we talked about that Barbie doll, the Ken Barbie doll with a wig. It's confusing to children because they assume that that person is a girl just because of that. We then have things like drag queen hours and drag queen readings and all these different kinds of things. We have teachers that are dressing up as the opposite sex as well. It's confusing to children. And a lot of what we call grooming is a breakdown of the natural defenses that children have. So children are naive, children are gullible, but they also have a kind of natural instinctive reflex. So I'll ask you a question and I'll ask your viewers a question, and you can just reflect on how it was. Okay. How far can you remember back to when you were young? Obviously,
How
8.
about 3?
3?
For me.
Okay. Wow,
About 3.
that's far back. Let's pick a number that most people can attain, which is, let's say, 10 years old.
Okay.
So you're 10 years old. Imagine you're 10, people watching, you're 10, whether you're a man or a woman, doesn't matter. This works a bit less so for boys, but it's fairly on average the same. So imagine you're 10, okay, and you're by yourself. And I was going to use Korean for a moment. My brain has too many languages. A man that you don't know suddenly appears where you are. What is your feeling now? You're by yourself. A man just appears. Are you comfortable?
No. Definitely not.
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
That's fairly similar for girls and boys. Boys generally a little bit less of a strong reaction, but girls definitely. I've done this experiment with maybe 140 people so far, and the reaction has been fairly similar. How how about if a woman you don't know shows up? You're still 10 and there's a random woman that shows up.
Yeah, it's a lot less than the man, but it's interesting you mention it. I'm going to start sizing up the woman and looking even at 10 and looking at her looks. You know what I mean? So in other words, I'm going to be looking at her physical presence and what other markers she has, but my initial reaction is going to be less fight or flight,
Right.
right?
So
And of course, then it's going to depend where I am when this person shows up. But
sure, sure. There's a lot of variables to take into account, but we're just talking on
right.
average.
On average, yeah,
So
a strange woman shows up and,
you
yeah,
you're probably going to be much less concerned than a man, just on average. You said you size
absolutely.
her up. Does she look kind? Does she look friendly? Is her tone of voice
Mhm.
friendly? Uh,
Correct.
does she have
The more
warmth?
feminine she's going to be. I mean, literally, when I said I size her up, is I'm going to be, even at 10, what I would likely be looking at is her level of, external sort of feminine traits, if you will. Maybe more if she's smaller, more petite and not super muscular. If she has longer hair, if she just has, you said, like a softer voice, there are going to be certain traits that I would look at and say less threatening.
That is a very basic reaction that we see with kids everywhere. They kind of size an adult up. Now that's a basic instinct. We If we look at babies, for example, which is why Ibram Kendi is very wrong. Babies don't recognize things like race. It's not an
No.
issue to them because you don't care about that. What you care as a baby is your primary caregiver. So your primary caregiver in 99.9% of cases is your mother. So you're going to look for indications of people who are similar to your mother, and that will become your in group. Why? That is how you survive. When you cry, that is the person that comes to say, okay, you're hungry, here, have a meal. So kids pick up on verbal and visual cues, not skin color. When we're
True.
talking about these verbal cues, it can be even the kind of dialect she's using, the language she's using. If I, for example, get a Chinese baby and I'm speaking English, the reaction will be very different if I'm speaking the dialect that baby is used to hearing in Chinese. Because
Right.
now I'm in group and now I'm a potential protector or a potential giver of something. So that's how children's minds work. Coming back, because I have a tendency to derail myself completely, coming back to the development, children are going to try and pick up on cues that they find of someone friendly like that. So something relatable, like they're something similar to their parents, perhaps. If they don't have parents that are particularly wonderful people, unfortunately, there are people that are not particularly wonderful as parents. Yeah, they could be abusive or the home environment might not be very good. They're going to pick up on anything else that indicates that this person is a protection to me or for my long-term well-being. They care about me. Kids automatically hone in on that. So if you have a teacher that is pretending to be very caring about the students and that student has a difficult home life, it's very easy for them to get pulled into that affection, even if that teacher does not have their best interest in heart. And the more fun and the more appealing they make it look, the more likely it is to work. So we look at the teachers teaching this queer ideology to their children. They use a lot of bright colors. We see these flags being made. They're all very bright. And I actually saw, it was quite interesting, a teacher who had put up all these bright flags and then made a heterosexual flag in black and white. Very, very boring,
Okay.
very dull.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want to be like this, right?
Mm.
That's disturbing.
Rainbow colors, right?
Yeah,
We had
rainbow
rainbow
colors.
fish
You're
as a story,
special. If
right?
you're like this, you're special. If you're not like this,
Sparkly.
well, you're not that exciting. It's very important. Children want to try and fit into the group. Yeah.
That is true. I was just going to say, I don't even know that the home life needs to be particularly unpleasant. I think we underestimate how emotionally neglected our children are. I think these cell phones and devices
Oh, they're terrible.
and televisions and everything have become stand-ins for attention, and because parents are also addicted to them, they don't even notice that
No.
they have been disassociating in terms of their physical and emotional connection from their children. And while you were talking about the different stages, there's something that I'd like to put in people's minds, is that with each of these stages, children are also moving extremely gradually away from their attachment to their parents. And I mean physical, and especially mother, especially mom. Remember, at one time, the baby was literally physically attached to a person for 9 months. And then as they come out of the womb, they're moving away from that physical attachment more slowly than any other mammal on the than any other animal on the planet, but certainly even than any other mammal. And when you get into the 10 to 11-year-old age, there's a push me pull you game going on. There's the, like, mommy, go away. Mommy, go away. They want you, they don't want you. They want you, they don't. And when I say they want you, they want hugs. They want physical touch. They want you to brush their hair. They want you to, you know, have the same kind of physical affection that they had when they were younger. To abruptly withdraw that, which happens sometimes by accident when you put them in daycare, because now they're with a stranger who is in many cases precluded from touching them except when absolutely necessary. So they're not getting a lot of physical affection. They're not getting a lot of that loving, caring, truly benign touch. And then they go on into kindergarten, and it just keeps going. So they're cut off rather abruptly from that attachment. And that can, in not all children, but in many children, create a little bit of a wound, a little bit of a sense that I need this kind of affection. I wasn't ready to be completely physically cut off from knowing that I'm loved and cared about, and that somebody is shielding me and protecting me in a very physical way. And so then if that child gets into an environment with an adult who provides it, it feels good. Literally, physically feels good, emotionally feels good. And the adults who are doing it ought to know. They ought to know. Now, when a parent is doing it, and of course the parent knows the boundaries and respects the child's boundaries and doesn't just go, hug them when they don't want to be hugged. If they pull away, they let them go and those kind of things.
Right.
But children don't have the same fear of pushing mom away if they don't feel like a hug, or pushing away, dad, if they're, they don't have the same degree of that. Whereas if it's teacher, it's a little different.
Right.
When it's a stranger, it's a little different. They're socialized to respect this person, defer to this person in a different manner than they are their parents, and yet something in them craves that affection. So there's a confusion, I believe, and also a kind of discomfort that can be exploited. I'm not a
Definitely.
professional, but that's my feeling as a
No,
mom.
that's definitely true. I mean, at that stage, children are coming to. We hear this a lot with all this queer theory, but kids are figuring themselves out. They're figuring out an identity, right? How they fit into the world. So it's very easy for them to get drawn into something where they say, "Oh, well, you're this, and this is a positive thing." Um, that's also part of grooming. I mean, if
Right.
we look at what grooming entails, one of the main things that groomers do is create some kind of wedge between the parent-child relationship. I mean,
Right.
there are parents that groom their children too and abuse their children. It's a sad and horrific fact, but there are many cases like that. But we're talking now, obviously, about when an outside party is doing it. What they need to do is separate that child from the parent, the relationship, because that's a protection to the groomer. It stops information going to the parent, obviously, and it also gives the groomer more control over the child. So the groomer basically is a replacement for the parent. That's very dangerous. Yeah. So in situations where abuse happens, that's many times why a child is unable to report abuse until many years after the fact, because that was a trusted person. They completely trusted that person.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't think anything that that person would do would be bad to them. So this is very disconcerting, and that's actually one of the main arguments that the pro-pedophilia movement latch onto. They're saying, well, it wasn't that the child was upset at that time at me doing that. So what they're saying is, well, basically, it is not that that action was bad, but society's reaction to my action was bad, and therefore my action is not bad. The reaction of society is what caused the trauma to the child. That's what they're saying. I've seen this so many times. It is so horrific. And that is why they're saying that they believe that children can consent. I'm not even joking. Yes. This is the common theme. This is what NAMBLA has said. This is what PI in the UK has said. This is what the Dutch Pedophile Association has said, a member of which was arrested this week. Yes. He tried to go to Mexico, and he was arrested in Mexico for trying to buy a girl. But he's arrested now, and hopefully he stays in a Mexican prison and not a cushy Dutch prison. So this is an ideology that's been going for a very long time, and there's this kind of perverted circle or triad between the Netherlands, the UK, and the US. So a lot of US pedophiles, they went to the Netherlands because the laws at that time for child protection were weaker. And then all the groups worked together to make a pedophile research journal, which basically justified it. And that was called the Pideka. And it ran for quite a number of years and involved many professors in many universities that quietly condoned it, and also members of all, basically, the pedophile organizations. PI, Dutch ones were involved, NAMBLA was involved, and this ideology is continually being pushed throughout academia and throughout the education system. So we have the queer ideology breaking down children's natural defenses, and then we have the pedophile normalization movement saying, well, this should be recognized and destigmatized, and our rights are being abused. So we have this pincer attack from both sides on the minds of children and their long-term well-being.
How do they get around the child development argument, though? See, as you pointed out, we've known for a long time, and there's
Their argument is that is a natural part of development. Their argument is that from birth, all children are sexual. That is the argument they're making. We have on record individuals saying that, well, a baby touching themselves is a form of whatever.
Even if that were true, which it's not, but even if that were true, that somebody doing self-exploration, like alone, okay, right? In private, alone with obviously themselves, is not even close to the same thing as saying, I can conceptualize doing this with another person, having a relationship with all the risks associated with another person. That it's the human brain at that age is not capable neurologically of conceptualizing a sexual relationship.
It's
It's
not.
simply not.
It's simply not. It's not developed because especially prepubescent children, that part of the brain it's not switched on yet.
No, that's
They're
what the
not aware of the
pituitary
concept.
does.
Right.
Right.
That's when everything develops. So I mean, that age child, those parts are not even developed in any way. They are for getting rid of bodily waste, basically. That's their function until much later when they actually develop properly into fully fledged reproductive organs.
Right.
These movements are also saying that yes, children can consent. That's what they believe. That children are aware of this and want a relationship. So it's really what they're doing is basically a perversion of the adult parent relationship. So they're saying a child wants a meaningful relationship. Yes, children want love and affection. That is not love and affection. That is a perversion. That
It's
is
exploitation.
degeneracy, exploitation. That is
Mhm.
only one directional. It is not in the child's best interests. It is not part of the child's development. Then we take a look back and they say, well, the Greeks did this and the Romans did this, blah, de, blah, de, blah. And you would have to say, okay, look at the results of those civilizations, what happened to them. And look at what stage of history those civilizations accepted that. It wasn't in the beginning when they were strong cultures. It was in the end when they had already given themselves over to every type of decadence. And then that is what became acceptable. And it wasn't very long until they got, well, the Greeks got mowed into the ground by the Romans, and the Romans got mowed into the ground by all the Celtic and Germanic peoples. Didn't do
Right.
them a lot of good.
One could make a
We,
case that
yes,
it's a sign of a failing civilization.
right, right,
There's enough
definitely.
evidence to support that. There's certainly more evidence to support that than they have evidence to support their arguments.
Right.
Much more.
And they're saying, well, this is a human rights issue. It is a human
Hmm.
rights issue for
For the
children,
child.
not for you. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, so we see this. We have, and I quote, a professor that said that these pedophiles should be given high quality child pornography in order to stop them from offending.
I need to
I'm
exploit children to prevent me from exploiting children
okay. Now the
is
argument they're
not
making
really
is, well, we don't need to necessarily give them actual images. It can be AI generated. Uh,
okay.
there are
We
a
know
lot of problems
scientifically
with
that
that.
when you titillate people like this, they are more likely
Right,
to
right.
offend. That is a
So
fact.
exactly, and we also have the same groups. Okay, I'm going to mention two groups who are very, very well documented: prostasia and before you act. Okay. Um, these groups, they are all for normalizing pedophilia, destigmatizing it. Now, they say that we are not destigmatizing the action, we are destigmatizing the sexuality. They're saying it's a sexual orientation. That's the main thing that they want. Now, I want viewers to understand that when you do that in most Western countries, you are actually legalizing it because orientation is a protected category. It's a very, very small step from saying it's an orientation to normalization, destigmatization. It just becomes another letter in the alphabet soup. It's something to be concerned about because never say never. And it's getting to the point where that's happening. Now, Prostasia too, they've been researching and they put money into finding results that they want. Before you act, it sounds like a lovely name, doesn't it? Think before you act. This is not actually a message to pedophiles. Do you know who this is a message for? This is a message to clinicians. Think before you report that person. It's still on the pedophile side. So they are very involved with the Johns Hopkins University. And that's why Johns Hopkins University has a bad reputation in this area. The founder of Before You Act is Michael Melsheimer, and he was a multi-child rapist, pederast. He was a member of NAMBLA, and he is on record saying that he wanted to make an organization like NAMBLA, but that could use academic sources to justify, basically, pedophilia, and that it is not a disease in his mind. So we have these two groups that have a lot of influence, and we're seeing this idea continually spread through academia. But it's been around a long time. Like I said, the Paidika, that journal, it has been supported by a lot of academics, and there are a lot of academics that are involved in this kind of apologesia of the pedophile movement. Interestingly, many of those same academics are also proponents of the queer movement. So we see a connection between the two. There's been a serious breakdown in any kind of social morality, which is what they're aiming for.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about the self, not about the children at all. So there's so many levels on which this is very wrong and very unscientific. Now, the problem with this is that with all these theories, is the academic system is designed through a peer review system, which is very open to exploitation and gatekeeping, which is frightening because academics are sometimes incredibly stupid. So what they do is, for example, you have an idea, Deborah, and you come to me and you tell me about this wonderful idea that you've had, and you say, it's great, isn't it? Don't you agree with me? And then I can say yes or no after looking at the facts. It depends what argument you make. But now imagine that a whole lot of like-minded people have said, actually, being an alcoholic is not that bad, and it should be fine to drive a car. And now a lot of people get together and then make a paper on that. And then you get other people to agree with you. And you get other people to agree with you. And you publish more papers. You write a book about why being an alcoholic is actually good and driving a car is totally fine and safe. And you support that with lots of studies that are written from your angle. Now, someone that is not familiar with that, they read that, what are they going to think? Well, an academic wrote this. It must be right. It's been done in a scientific way. And slowly that idea then becomes solidified as orthodoxy in academia. That is why academia has many, many terrible ideas that are supported by their followers with a very, very strong fervor. I mean, we can look at lots of things like social Darwinism was a terrible idea that ended up killing millions of people, and plenty of inherits to that. We have Lysenkoism, which was in the USSR, and it was the science, and millions of people starved. So
they're doing it now with medical. They're doing it now. I think
right.
we have medical.
The whole trans children thing is modern Lysenkoism. It's this. Puberty blockers are very powerful drugs that have very powerful side effects. Lupron is one that's commonly used, and it is used to castrate sex offenders. This came out in the documentary, but it's also used for precocious puberty. So one of the defenses of this is, well, it's used for precocious puberty. We've known about it for 30 years. Yes, we have. It's also one of the medications with a huge list of people that have irreversible health problems. Women with osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, just a plethora of problems. And what happened is they gave this to girls for precocious puberty to alleviate the symptoms. Obviously, the children were under distress. They averaged about 6 months on this. Now we have women in their 20s with arthritis, osteoporosis, and a whole other plethora of health problems. And what they have in common is that they use Lupron. So, yes, we've been using this for 30 years and it's been having disastrous consequences, sometimes more disastrous than the things that they were treating for.
Yeah.
So to say that you can stop puberty, no. You cannot stop something that is a normal, natural cycle. You can stop it, but there is no way that you're not going to have side effects.
Right.
It's a moving vehicle and you're throwing a spanner in the works. There's no way it can be normal. This is where we come back to the whole consent thing. We have this wonderful code called the Nuremberg Code.
Mm-hmm.
And it enshrines that a subject of medical attention should, in cases where it is not an emergency, be completely aware of said complications of the process or of the treatment that takes place. Because of children's inability to understand this abstract idea, children do not understand the concept of gender, as in gender studies, in gender ideology. Because they cannot understand that complicated concept, which most adults apparently can't understand either, if we see that they cannot define what a woman is, then it is not possible for them to consent to take medication that will sterilize them, destroy their bones, give them all kinds of health problems, and certainly not for cross-sex hormones that will eventually give them different types of cancer and destroy their neural makeup. It's a travesty, and it is illegal.
We don't need new laws saying, don't teach this specific subject or don't teach that specific subject. We just need to enforce the child protection laws we have. We need to enforce the decency laws we have. I'm speaking as an American from an American perspective. I can't speak for other countries, but in this country, we are literally ignoring the laws on the books that we have to protect children.
Most countries have
We're doing it in a
indecent
discriminatory
laws.
way.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've been seeing what's going on in the news, and I mean, America has indecent exposure laws. You are not allowed to do most of the things that are being done. Yeah,
that is correct.
So it is disturbing that these things are taking place, and it is disturbing that children are being attacked from both sides. Now is a very bad time in Western history to be a child in a Western country because of all this nonsense. And I read very sad experience of someone that went onto puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and all the operations, and who now regrets that, and the damage is done. You just that person has then a lifetime of being basically tormented in that condition. What can they do? And if we look at the suicide rate after 10 years at 40% after transition, it seems that it's obviously not working. So why be putting children through this? It's Munchausen's by proxy. It's child abuse. That's what it is. There's no other way of saying it. It's child abuse. Yeah. Don't
Right.
fix what ain't broke.
That's correct. It's, childhood, puberty, adolescence were never meant to be perfectly smooth sailing where you're happy and joyful every day and you feel perfectly comfortable in your own skin and
No.
so forth. And the tragedy is that because of the way this has been handled, the children who are what we might call it's extraordinarily rare, please hear me, but the children who are legitimately intersex and or have gender dysphoria, which is a real medical condition, who need treatment, psychiatric treatment, and it's a long-term kind of treatment, they're not being properly identified or properly treated because everybody's rushing in and popularizing this for everyone. And so it's like when it was believe all women, actual victims of sexual assault were kind
Right.
of getting
Right.
you have
Well,
to remember.
that's
Yeah,
one of the things that have even a lot of radical feminists have been saying. Well, the problem with that is that a lot of the actual victims are not being believed now because it
that's
was just
correct.
like this big boo-ha. So
Exactly.
that's a problem too.
Right. We should be
These things
studying
have
why people
long,
have gender dysphoria. We should be studying that, not coming up with really super expensive, fancy new ways to just quote unquote treat it with cosmetic surgery and drugs, especially in pre rational children.
right.
It's barbaric.
In 2017, I already said that this is going to become industrialized by the pharmaceutical industry. And I hate to be right, but that is exactly what is happening. And they don't care as long as they make money. You have to remember, and it's not like there's this big pharma conspiracy that I'm talking about. I'm talking about that industry. In many of those companies, they profit off other people's sickness and pain. They don't necessarily profit off making things that make humanity better. I know companies where there are individuals that are sincere in making medication that they think will help humanity. Unfortunately, there are corporations that don't care about that. And the fact that every large corporation seems to support it is even more suspect. You have to wonder why. Because these organizations, they don't do things when there's not profit involved. It's called corporatism. It's like capitalism on steroids without a conscience. And it's certainly harming children. That's why we're seeing a lot of these books also being pushed. We spoke about propaganda in another video. This is just an extension of that. How do you do propaganda? Well, you saturate the environment. So that is the only message that is being heard. It doesn't matter if it's true. It doesn't matter if it's false. It's just that is the only message you're getting. The other problem is that we see is that a lot of children that are actually diagnosed with other emotional or mental conditions, and a lot of autistic children are now identifying as being some other gender. So that is serious predation on a vulnerable group. Within a vulnerable group, children are already vulnerable. And now you're taking these young people, even very small children that are confused, and pumping them full of things. It's completely unethical. I foresee that there may be some very large lawsuits in the future as more and more people wake up to what's happened to them. Yeah.
Right.
Another thing that we see is that gender dysphoria is actually incredibly rare.
Yeah.
It's not a common thing.
Mm-mm.
Also, intersex conditions, the person is still either male or female.
Correct.
Even if they have a mutation, they are still either male or female. the majority of those are very much comfortable and know which sex they are. So it is not as if they are confused about what they are. They know they're a woman or they know they're a man. Many of those conditions have also serious health problems. Yeah, there are ones that are quite okay, but then there are conditions like monosomy X, which is just one X chromosome. They have a lot of health problems. There's trisomy, which is 3 X's, and they generally don't have as many. Sometimes it's not noticeable.
Mm-hmm.
That is a different thing. That is not gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is we see fully grown adult males who suddenly say that they're women. And this is actually a paraphilia called autogynephilia. Auto is self, gyna is woman, and philia is the love of something. So basically, they like the idea of themselves as a woman.
Right. The character in Silence of the Lambs.
Well, basically, yes.
Yeah.
And these are the ones that are pushing the strongest to go into women's bathrooms and to be in women's spaces. And that's a cause for concern. That's a genuine cause for concern. When we look at prison populations, this was, I believe, for the States. In the general prison population, about 11% of the male population was there for sex crimes. 11% out of the total prison population. When we look at people displaying autogynephilia, they were actually 48% of individuals showing that. It means the chance of deviant behavior by that group is much higher than the general male population. So statistically, they are more dangerous to a woman or to a child than your average male. Someone that doesn't have control over themselves in that area is more likely to not have control of themselves in that area in a situation where they feel that they can get away with that.
When you add to that the social perception that a woman or someone who cosmetically looks like a woman in any respect is less threatening than a man,
right?
Then you begin to understand why when people say, but you wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. And women like me are saying, that's the point. That's kind of the point, is that, if I can't tell the difference because of your cosmetic different, long hair, nails, high heels, a dress, makeup, or whatever, if that's what you're telling me. And I'm not talking about somebody, let's say like Blair White can't tell the difference, where somebody has literally completely surgically changed themselves and they are living as a woman. They've been living as a woman, and they're still a man. They know they're a man, but they're I don't know how to explain this.
But that's actually gender dysphoria as opposed to autogynephilia, right?
Correct. So there's, I can't tell the difference because I literally can't tell the difference, like in any way, shape, or form. And I was in the ladies' restroom and I glanced to my right and saw long hair and like felt my guard was down a little bit, but turns out that's an AGP, and that's literally a man in every possible respect. And you finish the rest of the sentence. So it that is exactly the point.
Right.
We don't do, if women and men for that matter don't go into these vulnerable places and do a complete once over on the stranger standing next to them. That would be considered rude. It would be weird. We don't, we have our guard heightened slightly, but we also have it lowered slightly. So it depends on a couple of factors, but we go into a place we presume to be private. We presume we're somewhat protected from the prying eyes of the public. It's why there's a door and another door and stalls and different things. And so that lowers your guard a little bit. You think you're sequestered away from the general public to do something that makes you vulnerable. And then, you're heightened enough socially that you don't stare, you don't scrutinize. That would be considered strange. So it's a weird mix that people don't think about, we don't talk about. People will make assumptions and presumptions, and I'm over here going, I'm sorry, you have it wrong. You're just wrong. That's not how we think. That's not what we do. And you're making all kinds of judgments on why we feel the way we do about these policies that are just grounded in false reality. You're
Right.
just wrong.
The interesting thing I find is that people from really, really different viewpoints. I mean, we have men's right activists, we have rad femmes, we have just average men and women. They all agree on this.
Yeah.
It's strange. It's the thing that seems to unite everyone. And yeah, that's telling you something. The thing is, when we look at this, so children are now having their guard lowered by being taught, well, a girl can be a boy, or vice versa, or anything really goes. And then they have these predatory individuals. We have the pedophilia normalization movement. All these things are socially degrading and kind of giving the idea that anything goes. The problem is, when this was attempted in the 60s, 70s, it failed because people were more traditional in their viewpoints of things like morality. Now it's working because many people have a very live and let live viewpoint. Unfortunately, bad people don't like to let other people live. So we're now at a point where our culture, it probably won't survive this. If you want an example, we can look at Afghanistan. So people say, okay, destigmatize pedophilia, and then people will want to get help and they'll be fine. This is the argument that many groups are making. So they're saying stigmatizing it causes offense. Let's look at places where it's been destigmatized. That's all you need to do, and look at the result. Afghanistan, it is as destigmatized as it can be. Okay, so when the Taliban were not ruling, there is the cultural practice of bachabazi, which is basically pederast men raising boys as girls, and yeah, you can imagine the rest of what happens there. That is considered normal. What is the result for those boys? There is not less pedophilia in that society. There is more because it is normalized.
Right.
It is considered acceptable. Then under Taliban rule, they banned that. Unfortunately, the Taliban's view of women is less than desirable. So we have child marriage, 8, 9, 10-year-old girls being married off. It is considered normal in their culture. It is the normalization of that. Has it resulted in less child marriages or more child marriages? That's all you have to answer. What is the end result of any ideological group, of any movement, of any idea? You only have to consider the end result. For example, does the queer movement produce people that are more emotionally stable? Are they better communicators? Are they happier people?
Right.
That's the only question you need to answer. If the answer is yes, then that's beneficial. If the answer is no, it is not beneficial. The simplest questions, like what is a woman, are the easiest questions to answer to know if something is factual or not. That is basic science. We have moved totally away from basic science towards the science of emotion, or whatever that is, a person's feeling on something. So you only need to answer, is it beneficial? What is the end result? Does it make better people? If it doesn't, you have your answer. Are children now happier than children 20 years ago? Has suicide rate gone up or down? These are very, very simple questions. What exists now that did not exist then? One of the things that is emotional blackmail that is often said is, okay, if children aren't affirmed, they will commit suicide. But
Mm.
if we look at suicide ideation for teenagers, there is no difference in the number between regular teenagers and those who identify as something else. Overall figures. Why? Because children at that age are unsure of themselves. They're having a hormone rush. They make bad decisions. That's what it's part of growing up, unfortunately.
Right.
So just saying, oh, you've had this bad thought, let's pop a whole bunch of drugs into your body that will alter your biochemistry and destroy your brain. Yeah, it doesn't seem like a very good way forward. If someone has schizophrenia and they're seeing something around, it doesn't help to affirm it. It's actually bad for that person.
Mhm.
This is the only condition that somehow people have decided, well, I guess we can make money off this, so we're going to affirm it. That's
Right.
disturbing, very disturbing. And
Well,
I mean, if for example they're using the 40% suicide rate, and they're saying if you don't affirm it, what's going to happen is these people will commit suicide. Okay, so you're also saying that they've existed in all history. This is not a modern phenomenon. Many people are saying. All right. So we need to look at the suicide rates and look at all the bodies piled up of these people with this condition, and then we can prove our point. The problem is that doesn't exist. So
so unless you're
somewhere
going to
that
say there's
came,
something in the water,
well, yes,
literally,
literally, maybe, yeah.
right?
But it might be something in the teaching rather than something in the water.
You'd think, and it seems to make sense. And some of the same people who will be very quick to say that parents shouldn't take their children to church or shouldn't, take their children to, I mean, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scout, whatever, some of the thing, because that's indoctrination. When you talk to them about environmental factors, oh no, not in this case. And I did also want to mention that we've been talking so far in this conversation about some worst case scenarios as far as detransitioners and people who wake up with terrible, terrible physical damage later on in life after going through these treatments. But I want to make sure people understand that even if they didn't, even if there weren't a physical manifestation of, the damage, understand that if you wake up, for lack of a better term, later in your life and realize you were manipulated into making a decision, if you come into the awareness, as many, many, many people do, not just detransitioners, but people who've been groomed in other ways as well, people who are just groomed ideologically, when they have that realization it was not their choice, that they did not in fact consent because this was done to them as a child, that is very damaging. That is traumatic in and of itself, and can create a lot of turmoil and regret and suicidal ideation if it's extreme. So, when you add the physical damage on top of that, I really wanted to make that point because there are people who have talked to me about their ideological grooming by similar people to have certain world views and so forth, and how painful it was to realize that adults had lied to them, had manipulated them, had hidden real, facts from them, had taken advantage of their youth and inexperience. So when children kind of wake up to this in their, adulthood or young adulthood, it does something. Or even, if you're farther along, you could be middle-aged and have this happen to you. Anything in your past up to that point becomes painful to think about, and you're going to have to work through forgiving yourself. You're going to have to work through, the resentment and the anger you feel towards those people. If some of those people are still in your life now, you may have severed ties that you have to deal with, and relationships that end up broken. And there are few things more painful other than the physical is probably the worst, but then secondarily, looking at the life you've lived, and remember, our lives are short as human beings, and not really being able to comfortably think about decades worth of it, because it just brings back bad memories, or it makes you feel guilty, resentful, and all these negative emotions. So you're not just stealing the person's present and stealing their potential future in terms of what they could have been. That was none of your business. That was for them to decide and become. But once they get there, you've stolen their past, because that is not something people want to think about, those decisions they made that really weren't their own. So where do we go from here? It sounds pretty bleak.
Legislation needs to be such that it's protecting kids. I mean, there's no reason for children to be exposed to these things at school. They need to learn mathematics, English, biology, whatever, without any of the ideological nonsense. They need to be taught at a level that they can actually understand. None of this garbage is what children at the age of 3 or 4 can understand. Doesn't fit any of the models, doesn't make sense whatsoever. Most kids think that superheroes are real in some capacity. So there's no way that you can say that they actually understand these abstract concepts. The only person that you're convincing is yourself. If you're saying that, you're lying to yourself. I think education programs, they should be teaching these theories to teachers properly so that they actually know. Because I think some teachers are just getting brainwashed into just teaching this nonsense because they feel that they have to, or they feel that's the kind thing to do. Legislation also needs to pick up on child protection and make sure that these things aren't normalized. Now's the time to stop it. Yeah. If it is not stopped, I can guarantee you that the pedophilia normalization movement, in a few years, they will have made their mark, and they will have integrated into the alphabet soup. There are already people advocating for that.
Right.
People from many different organizations. I'm busy on a project where I'm mapping out all the connections, and it's bad. It's really bad. Right. I mean, this is a really far-stretching, across continents, across cultures, very disturbing. Once again, I'm coming back to the point: know what your kids are studying, know who they have access to, know what kinds of excursions their teachers have planned. Visit the classroom. Some of these people are not particularly shy about what they're on about. Visit the classroom. If the teacher has social media, just check it out, because they might be giving you very clear signals that you need to be concerned. Yeah.
Right.
Also,
right.
Formative years, like I've said before, if you can, formative years should be spent with the parents, not a kindergarten or something like that. Yeah. Have as much to do with your child as you can when they're young, because you're not going to get it back. Don't care what skin color you are, what culture you are. This is just biologically, that's what you have to do.
And I mean it. Affection matters. That's not to say every kid wants the same amount, but try to notice what signals your child is sending you about attachment. And if they are appearing to want more, give it to them. When they're babies, I think is the most important time, because then I've noticed that the more they're physically connected to you in their infancy, whether you carry them around, like wear them in a sling or wear them some kind of way, or holding them in some respect, they are actually more secure and more willing to break away from you in good and healthy ways, and then come back and go and come back, whatever. And they're less likely to cling inappropriately either to you or to other people when they get older. So those attachments need to be, They need to be broken off in a developmentally appropriate way,
Right.
and it really should be the child leading the way. The child leading the way. I see a lot of parents that are like, no, you're a big boy. You don't sit on my lap now when they're like 5,
Yeah. No.
or and they, like, oh, boys don't cry and I don't hug it, or even little girls. It's like, a pat on the head, and it's tragic what we've done in the name of protecting children from abusers. I think even some fathers, some of them are like hesitant to show physical affection to their girls for fear that someone will misinterpret it.
I
And that
think
just
I think
breaks
a
my
lot of
heart.
I think a lot of fathers that have experienced that abuse as children
Yeah,
are afraid of potentially, yeah, miscommunicating or something because they're not comfortable with what's happened to them as a child.
right,
So they don't have that connection, even though they want to have the connection with their children.
right.
Yeah.
If you have a hesitancy about hugging your children, about, holding them or sitting with them while watching television, like with your arms around them, or, having them on your lap. And again, I'm talking about when they're small. Holding hands with them at the movies. I mean, I do this still. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and when we go to the movies, we hold hands. And
Yeah,
it's just that
that
little bit
should
of
be normal. Yeah.
yeah, that little bit of contact. When we walk around, when we go shopping, we hold hands. And I noticed in some other cultures, they do this regularly, even into adulthood. The mother and the daughter, the mother and the son even will hold hands. And it's there are healthy ways to communicate attachment and emotional bonds to your children. And I find that the electronics are getting in the way. Some of the social messaging is getting in the way. We're adultifying our children much too soon, and they're looking to other people for those attachments, not
Right.
consciously. It's a very deep emotional need. And I don't know, that's just something that I would like to add to the mix of this conversation, because children with poor attachment bonds are much more vulnerable.
Right. And they're also much less likely to communicate that something bad has happened to them.
That's correct.
Yeah. So
That's correct.
yeah, a good parental affection is uh is really important. To
Right.
illustrate that fact, I'm not sure, you might have heard this before, but a certain hospital, they had all the children that are given birth to where the mothers cannot take care of the children. So in that hospital, these very young newborns are in a room, basically in incubators to be looked after.
Mhm.
For some reason, the mortality rate of this particular bed was very low. And the hospital was perplexed as to why the child that is put in this bed always somehow has a higher survival rate. And the reason was that the cleaner came in at night and she picked up that child and held them and put them back and continued to clean. She just did it for that bed because obviously there's a lot of kids. And this was picked up on CCTV. And doctors realized, okay, children really need affection. So that just illustrates the point.
Mhm.
It doesn't seem like anything major, but children are designed to want to be loved. And when I'm saying love, I mean in a clean, platonic, parental way. That is what they need: affection, proper love.
Right. Right.
So the more you can cultivate that, the better. And it is not easy for some parents because of their background. But as you practice, it will get easier. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Or get help if it's really that hard for you. That might be something that you seek some counseling about. It might even be the
Definitely.
thing that wakes you up to that something happened in your childhood, or that you need to deal with it. Maybe you thought you dealt with it, but you didn't. If you know that sometimes our children can be the catalyst to our own healing if we let them. And that's not to say you should ever use your child or project anything onto your child. I'm saying that
No,
you become a different person when when you take a child into your life, whether it's your natural born child or you adopt a child. When you become responsible for a child, it changes you. If
definitely.
you're now a parent or a caregiver for that child, and it changes you fundamentally to your core, and that can elicit responses that make you aware of something you weren't aware of before that you thought you had dealt with. So that can be a way you can help protect your child, is by figuring that out as well, because you're the guardian, not the school, not the daycare. You're not
Exactly.
co-parenting with them.
And I'll say, you mentioned that something changes in you. You literally change. Your brain, after being a parent, literally changes. For females, drastically, because you actually carry a child, if that's the child, if it's not an adopted child. But even if it's an adopted child, both males and females have brain changes because they're in a different mode.
That's right.
Males will become more protective after they have. You get really mellow guys become really uptight once they have kids because their brain chemistry changes. Yeah, that's normal.
That is normal, very normal. That's why the first year after you have a child can be difficult on a marriage, on a relationship, because you are
Right.
now getting used to literal, like, they're different people now. Everybody's going to respond differently to that. And it's just one of those things that the more prepared you are that the change is going to happen, the better you'll weather it. If you expect somebody to remain constant, remain exactly the same after they have children, you're in for a rude awakening. That's not how it works. And I think what I see the institutions around us doing, the schools and other, even the medical establishment, is actively trying to make parents question their own gut instincts, question their their natural protective nature, question their common sense. Any opinion that we might have about our child, they're telling us to disregard that, listen to us, because white lab coat and degrees after our names. Not all, obviously, but I'm seeing a big shift in that direction. And I've been cautioning parents, look who benefits. Be careful with people who have some kind of self-interest in you taking their advice about your child, because your interest is your child's interest. If you're a good parent, obviously, and that ought to be irrefutable. Theirs you should be skeptical about. They should demonstrate to you in so many different ways that they are not purely self-interested.
And look,
Because
there are brilliant teachers that really care about their students
of course,
and will do everything they can to get their students to excel in every possible ways. This is not ragging on teachers, which is a very, or used to be at least, a very respected profession.
right,
But
exactly.
at the same time, because standards for teaching are so low now, you have to be kind of careful. And unfortunately, some parents don't have access to education for their kids that really teaching them any of the basic things they need to do. Yeah, parents just need to be switched on.
Exactly, because this is a very real threat. And I am so grateful to you, especially given the lateness of the hour, folks who are listening or watching. uh Alaric is in South Korea, so it's practically the middle of the night there. So I am so grateful that you took this
No
time
worries.
to go through this vitally important information with us. Knowledge is power, folks. The more you know about how your children grow and develop and how their brains function, the better you'll be able to protect them. And they are under threat right now from some very bad ideas and
Please
some
protect your
malevolent people.
children.
Yeah.
Please protect your children. Evil is real. It is out there. It is after your children. Please,
Yeah.
please be awake. Please protect your children.